Human Humane Architecture host, Martin Despang, is so happy to have you back for another episode of Human Humane Architecture. Happens to be our 183rd one here on ThinkTech Hawaii. And you might be around being our 10,000th viewer, so thank you for that. So this is the volume 2 of our Larry's Wait Late Lust show that here we're still in the COVID pandemic and in climate change challenge and also in social equity struggle. So we're looking for potential solutions for our post-pandemic production phase. And we want to look above and beyond our traditional boundaries. And we're doing this now looking to my home country, Germany, as well as to the continental United States, in Tucson, Arizona, with our perfect guest, Larry Medlin again. Hi, Larry, good to have you back.
Nice to be with you again.
And let's bring up the first slide and sort of a little bit apologize for last week's volume 1, which was pretty much like a empathic, pretty much impulsive, we should say, expression of excitement of us reconnecting and wanting to do the best. But we basically went from you basically telling me your story and me basically illustrating, narrating it from basically material I pulled from everywhere and from the web. And then technology gave up on us. So now, thanks to P3, public-private partnership, working with the private sector and developer-architect Rob Paulus and his colleague David Driver, thankfully having provided the right ambience and space to fully have you with us, Larry, and everything also thanks to Chris Ford, my agent, who we had with his infrastructure show. So it all comes full circle and gets us all back together. So we're really happy. So let's sort of rewind and go back to the very beginning, and let's go to the very first slide. And you share with us what that sort of Bauhausian Berlin boxes that you visited in 1964 the first time, right?
That's in Turksteinweg 5 in Berlin-Zehlendorf. That's Frei Otto's building that he had just built shortly before that. That's his studio. That is, we're seeing it from the approach side, and behind it is a big garden where we did lots of model testing and so forth, some of which we'll look at today. So that's where I built all the models that became the conceptual models. Last week we talked a little bit about soap films, and the main thing at that time we were exploring was we knew you could take a tensile eye loop and then start to lift it out of a soap film and create a form that had anticlastic or opposing curvature, satellite curvature. And the question was then to explore how we could use that as a tool for major support and restraint items. And that's sort of the explorations that we did. And Frei Otto's comment was that, we could do that with soap films, but we've got to really test it and see if we can do it with physical structures. So there's some of the soap films. Some of those were actually, after Expo was over, I came back and did a much more in-depth study, comprehensively, of studying multiple possibilities for tensile components and so forth.
Yeah, and one of our biggest fans and viewers, your esteemed colleague Ron Lindgren, said, and hi Ron, he basically said, I've never heard about soap film, so tell us more. And I want to make sure, because you're so used to the term, unlike everyone else. So please explain to us, because it's actually meant to be not just figuratively as a metaphor, but it's literally, right? And you almost made it into a PhD that then your busyness and your professional and academic career kind of took you away from. But spend a couple of sentences that we're actually talking about real soap and real film. And you explained that to me, referring to the very top left image of the model the best, right? So how does that work?
Well, the top left model is a little ring, and that ring is exactly 100 millimeters in diameter. And underneath the table that's mounted in is a bowl of soap solution with a lifting device that you lift up, and the inside of that ring is tapered. Like the reference that everybody can sort of understand is, if you ever had a beer, the bubbles rise in the bottle of beer. The reason they rise is that they're going up the thin neck of the bottle and they're trying to contract and form the minimum surface that they can within that. And so that's the same principle. We can draw a soap film off a plate below, and then you have a flat 100 millimeter soap film to work with. And the first start was like in the slide in the lower right-hand corner, you see it's just a thread laid over the soap film. But the moment you start to pick it up out of the film, another third film pulls out, so that what is formed, and you can see that more clearly as it's lifted further in the next slide, is the film is pulled out. And so it forms at the 120-degree angle. But the point of the soap films is that they always seek the minimum surface and the least surface area, and they have uniform tension within the whole surface. So if you dominate that with physical structures, it means you're ultimately using the material in the most efficient way. So this next series of 3 slides here is a slide of just testing the simple eye loop as the first thing. That was the first thing that I did in Berlin, and Frei and I agreed that that's what we should do, to see if it was possible to build this in a material that was a net mesh material that you could use, and it would behave with similar properties like materials in a real structure would work. So here you see on the left is a plan view, and on the right is an elevation view of the same model. And what you can see is that if you look at plan view, the eye loop is almost a complete circle. It's just slightly flattened where it comes up to the point of support. And then the curve that you see hanging down that looks teardrop shaped is a curve of equal radius in space. That's to say, like if you imagine a corkscrew is a curve of equal radius around a straight line that runs through the middle of the corkscrew. So this was the purpose, to develop that form when we found that. And then the next slide is where we went to sort of multiple uses of that. This one, where we really wanted to, and that was the end result of maybe 20 or 30 different models, one of which I accidentally destroyed because I was clumsy and didn't pay Frei Otto's adherence never to use a electric drill in a thing, and I actually drew the whole structure down and collapsed it, but that's beside the point. So what this is 8 points, 4 points going up and points of support, and 4 points pulled down and points of restraint. And this is a model that in physical size is maybe 42 inches by 60 inches. It's a pretty big model. And the height is about 16 inches above that surface. And Frei and I were really conscious about wanting to have something that we could photograph and get a good documentation. And our concern was we didn't just want to produce a technological object without showing a configuration and a pattern in a way that it could be used. And that was the purpose of all the studies, to sort of aesthetically find something that was a reasonable proportion and so forth. And you'll notice there's subtle details, like on the edge, the supporting points around the perimeter are triangular. So the front edge of that clear plexiglass triangle is the compressive member that holds that up. And the guy goes through a notch in the back of that diagram through a hole in the model base, is drawn underneath the model base, and then it's pinned down and taped off underneath the model base. And so with this model, then in the back of Frei Otto's Entwicklungsstätte für den Leichtbau, Building Center for Lightweight Construction, we went out in the backyard and we had handles on the bottom of this model. And I literally was a human sort of tripod. I would sort of put it on my back and hold it up, and Frei would be there kneeling down and going at the angles and looking at, no, if we go more, we get better clouds this way, lift the back up about 6 inches. And I would do all those things, and we'd find the perfect position. And then we had an adjustable table that we could put it on. And he had a very good film camera that he took those photographs with. And the irony of that, he produced this photograph and some more that were even more elegant, in my opinion. And those were in his studio, and a gentleman from the German Federal Building Department stopped by to visit Frei Otto and see what he was doing. And so we showed him this model, and we showed him the photographs, which help you sort of visualize and how it would be in a scale that you could inhabit. And he got really excited. And so we were fortunate that our efforts to make something that would visually be exciting to people. So he said, you should be invited. We would like to invite you to do the competition for the German Pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal. There were 6 architects that were invited, and Frei Otto didn't have that established of an office. I was one visiting America, and he had one staff member that was there working with him in Berlin. And so I moved to Stuttgart and worked with Rolf Goodbrot, who was a very established post-World War II architect. He did the IBM building, which was one of the first modern buildings after the war in Berlin. And he did the Lieder Hall, or the concert hall in Stuttgart, which is a beautiful structure. So I went there, and then we started to work on what was the next part, the design of the competition. And I did that together with Herman Kendall, who was sort of my counterpart, the leader of his team, working on that. And we were a collaborative group to develop the design and planning for the German Pavilion, the West German Pavilion at that time for Montreal. The next.
Yeah, it gets us to the next slide that perfectly illustrates what you just said. There's Rolf here in a situation that you explained to me that wasn't actually the first presentation, but there is a 5 a.m. deadline story behind that model, right?
5 p.m.
Oh, p.m. I thought it was a.m., but doesn't matter.
The irony was that we were in Stuttgart. We'd worked all weekend to get the thing done. And I was selected as the person to get on the train, take the model, which was, you see it there. It was about 42 inches by 48 inches. It wasn't a small model. Mm-hmm. And take that in a tube of drawings and find the German Federal Building Department, turn it in by 5 o'clock. I was, learning German in the process, and my ability to ask direction, but I got there and was happy to have it delivered and submitted, and we were very fortunate to actually eventually win the competition. But what you can see in this model is we did that with a mesh material, so you can look inside and actually sort of representatively see the spaces and so forth. And it actually had in the lower slide, you see some floating panels up there. That was for a hanging garden, which never got executed, but was one of the ideas we were exploring at the time.
Cool idea, though. And I think, again, coming from basically soap to fabric, I guess the next challenge was to be questioned again. Well, this is beautiful. It's both poetic and pragmatic at the same time. But now transition that into the real deal and the real material, which is basically cables. And that gets us to the next slide, because you were then asked to basically prove it in real, right? With a small demonstration.
Well, we actually built the demonstration project to show that the construction system would work. And back then, you can't span the great distances that you can now. It had a 250-foot free span between the 2 highest masts in the German Pavilion. So to span that large structure, we used the steel cable net, which you see here rolled up, ready for shipment. It was basically rolled up in 10-meter long segments, just like a piece of carpet, and put in crates and shipped to the model where it could be laid out on the ground, and then the splice connectors joined together. So it would be like assembling the strips of a sail and then hoisting the actual structure up the mast to erect it.
And that was manufactured by Strohmeyer, right?
Yeah, that was there. Do we have that one slide that showed people?
Yeah, the next one, please. We have that one.
Yeah,
here it is.
That's. I was supervising the construction of the steel cable network, and you see this is how there's 2 bolts in each of those cable clamps, and people are right there with their extended set of drills, so they can simultaneously tighten those bolts that clamp down on the two cables and hold them at the perfectly located pre-marked position on it. So that's how the whole cable network was fabricated. And then for enclosure, a tensile membrane was used, and it was actually suspended below the cable network. And it was thought that that was only going to be there for the period of the one summer, although it did end up staying there for 7 years in the Man and His World exhibition that the mayor of Montreal did after Expo was over.
Mhm. And speaking of that, you shared, when you shared your big dilemma with having destroyed that beautiful initial model by not having taken your boss's advice of not using a power drill. When I was talking to my partner, our exotic escapism expert, Susanna, it reminded us of her son who was once taking a drill and trying to see what happens if he was like drilling into the bed sheets. And it certainly, I can only imagine, did the same thing that you kind of did, right?
Yeah, just swirl it right up around it. That's right.
Exactly. And talking, what, trial and errors that we learn the most from, and usually we don't talk about. Let us get to slide number 9, because there was a similar event that happened in the erection of the prototype, right? Where you also helped out. Share that moment, Larry.
That is it's actually the same structure. It was erected on a piece of property where a road was later planned to come through, so it couldn't stay there permanently. But it was put up as a way of testing the steel cable net. And you see here, before the membrane was put in underneath it to test that system and the vital eye loop enclosure and all of that sort of thing. But what happened was, there was a big day where Frei Otto went to the airport to pick up the head of the German Federal Building Department in Bonn was coming down to look at this structure. And it was going to be the go or no go moment about, does this structure look like something that Germany wants to use to represent its technology? And everybody was, as we talked about before, looking at the high standards the Germans had established in the earlier World Fair pavilions, like especially Mies van der Rohe in Barcelona in 1928. So what happened was, we were doing the final tensioning of this while he was on his way to the airport to pick up the gentleman from the Bundesbau direction, the German Federal Building Department. And one of the anchor rods had been bent in such a way that it sheared and it ruptured. So one anchor point in the back of the structure came loose, and the whole structure sort of sagged in. It looked terrible. And so the question was, well, all the workmen were there, and they had these come-alongs, all these devices and jacks. So they actually jacked it up and pulled it back and tied it off with ropes just so it was in correct position. And then I had them stand. There were about 6 or 8 of them. So they stood in a row right there, right up against that, so you couldn't see it. And so fortunately, that occurred on the left side of the picture at the back. And we had a timetable when the gentleman was coming. So we worked through the weekend, and it rained all weekend, and the whole site was just a complete muck basin. It was just mud everywhere. So he arrived, and he stopped on the right edge there, which got out of his limo that he came in from the airport, and he and Frei started to talk about it and looked at it, and he was this looks kind of interesting. And then Frei, being the guy that he was, he wanted to walk over to the back of the tent and introduce all the workers over there. But, I was able to sort of grab his attention instead of grabbing by the shoulder and say, no, you cannot go there. Listen, trust me, we're not going there. We're staying right here. And he just sort of looked at me, and then, we talked about it, and we actually got a tentative verbal approval that was later confirmed by official records and so forth, but this looked good and we could go ahead with this. And then after the the gentleman from the federal building department drove away, Frei Otto said, "What was that all about?" And I told the guys to step aside. And he saw our makeshift stand up there about how we dealt with the problem. And I told him the story. And he literally almost fainted on the scene. But, those kind of things happen.
The nature of pure prototyping, I tell you. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I love this picture because you got these kind of cute German single-family residences behind there, so typical for post-war, sort of like prude Germany. And then you get this playful, heroic experiment in front of it, right? And there's one thing that excites us so much about it, amongst all the other things, the many things, is your climate in Arizona, the hot arid, and ours in Hawaii, that actually, what you're putting up there is all we need, basically. And we see this in the future in your professional work, past the work with Frei and your academic work. But here we're again in Germany, and right now it's freezing cold outside. So you need to enclose this on the ground floor. And that gets us to the next slide, because you have another great picture from your archives illustrating that. And tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, then after the expo was over, and it was known that the test structure couldn't stay on that site where it was, it was picked up and moved to a property that had been allocated for it on the research campus in Stuttgart, Bayern, in a suburb of downtown Stuttgart. And this is where this is the same cable network. We learned some things about the foundation system and refined that. But here, then, this is the last thing that I sort of worked on before I left and came back to the States and started doing stuff at first at the University of Southern Illinois in Carbondale, and then Washington University in St. Louis. So what you see here is what we talked a little bit about the last time, the wood lattice system for the roof that's up above there, and then the edge members that are back out, you see on the outside there, going down to a concrete base. And you can see in the foreground the wooden sill that's anchored into. And so there's actually a wooden member that frames the window, and then there's a flat band of metal on the outside that's a tensile tie to sort of tie that roof down into a low position so it won't move at all, so it's fixed. And one of the things that we tried very hard to do was to have a relatively thin edge. So you see at the top, that's about 3.5 inches thick there. It's like a 2x, except it's only about a 1/2 inch thick. And that's what's bent going around at the edge. And that's just enough to cover the top of the frame there, the window, and the edge of the thickness of the cable roof. So it's really a thin system after it was built, and a layer of insulation, and then the shingles placed on the outside.
And let's go to the next slide. And this is great reference to where you're currently sitting, because Rob has this nice curved wooden roof in his office where you're sitting here. And here we're going out with you. Before you said, you went away to the United States and move on. This is sort of, let's look at the final product and have some coffee with you. And you're sitting there just as young as you still look, Larry. You're sitting there, and you see the wooden sort of sheathing over the cable network that you were describing last time, but we're lacking the image. So here's the image with the words from the last show.
Quickly review. There's a nailer strip that's just draped, and it's flexible enough to follow the curvature in that direction. And then perpendicular to that are tongue and groove elements that are just not quite pushed all tightly into the tongue and groove, and just slightly moved to make its way up between the cables and keep the alignment. So that you can sort of see that system pretty clearly in that image.
Yeah, and you can also see like the workshop atmosphere in the research building, and you can also see a theme that became prominent later on in Frei's work, which is the Wintergarten, right? The greenhouse
That's
effect.
right. That's right.
Basically having the low winter sun basically, help heating the building. I mean, all these things that he was then sort of developing more in the future of his career were already sort of, initiated here, right?
Well, what you were just talking about, there's a model, a wire model of the Institute for Lightweight Structures. And in that model, you can see through the wire net, but you see how the workshop building pokes out under the edge and another element, and how that comes together, how the components are, it's sort of an aerial view, it's like a, isometric drawing.
Yeah, no, I think we throw this into the many more shows to come. It's iterative, and as Jay likes to say, getting better every day and every show. So let's go to the next slide real quick, and we probably got to phase out pretty soon, but now we again go to the next stage, right? Which is like the macro spanning. I mean, this is the Montreal construction side. And we already talked about how you tested that with that metal model up there in the last show, but this gives you an idea of the sheer size of the Montreal, which is nothing compared to the little experiment building, right?
The tallest mast was 142 feet tall. And one of the theories was that the cable net had to be adjusted. And I showed the workmen how to do that down on the ground. That was just, to get the tension right. You loosen the cable and pulled it along and pulled it taut. And then we tested that we had the right tension and the tension gauge there. And
you probably go to the next slide for that. That gives even more an idea of how that looks like.
Well, that's one of the tall masts, but the one, so the story I was going to tell you, Martin, since you sort of asked me to tell some of these stories, was that the workmen wanted me to go see if the corrections they made were correct. And I said, sure, let's go. I sort of thought we're going to walk over to some edge of the pavilion on the ground somewhere. But no. The area they did the corrections they wanted me to approve was right up at the top of the mast. So I had to, in my youth, climb up to the top of that 142-foot mast, and it was like a rite of passage. Every workman was stopping me. There was even a team of fashion photographers photographing some fashion models, and they all stopped and watched to see if I was going to climb up to the top. But when I finally made it up there and got that, and we talked about what they did, and they did a pretty good job of it, and I mentioned that to them. It sort of was, I was a mensch. I had sort of passed my level of improvement with a construction team who were fantastic to work with from the beginning and throughout the entire process. Very knowledgeable and very capable of dealing with an unknown structure like this that had never been built before.
Awesome. And on that note, Larry, we had the next 28 minutes of your fascinating story, and there will be many more to come. So with that, we're at the end of the show. Please all stay healthy and happy and live a more ethereal, jungly life in our tropics. And thanks, Larry, again, and see you all back for the volume 3 of Larry's Weight, Light, Lust Live. Look forward to that. Bye-bye.